Imagine you're in Istanbul sometime around the mid-16th century. The city hums with distant prayers from the minarets, boatmen chant along the Bosphorus, and the warm scent of spice from the Grand Bazaar swirls through the air. Somewhere down a winding alley, past the stalls selling rosewater and dyed silks, a small crowd gathers beneath a low awning. They're not there to trade. They're sipping something strange, something bitter, something brown, something ... suspicious. This is coffee's quiet entrance into Ottoman life. But to fully appreciate how this new drink became controversial enough to warrant imperial intervention, we need to go back even further to the highlands of Ethiopia, where legend tells of Kaldi, a goat herd who noticed his flock becoming unusually energetic after nibbling red berries from a shrubby tree. While this story may sound like pastoral folklore, it has some basis in reality. Wild coffee plants did grow in the region, and the energizing effects of the beans were no myth. Coffee houses known as Kana began appearing in the capital around the 1550s. He was just 11 years old when he became sultan. For years, his mother, Kaksem Sultan, ruled in his place through a tangled web of court advisors. Coffee, by then, had become deeply entrenched in Istanbul's social life. The ban was enforced with intensity. Some sources claim Murad disguised himself to patrol the streets, personally doling out punishment to those caught in violation. Others suggest that surveillance squads monitored coffee houses for signs of subversion, and while executions may have been rare, beatings and public humiliations were not. But by the time he reached adulthood, Murad had grown weary of disorder. By temperament and philosophy, he was a strong man in 1633. He took power into his own hands with a vengeance. These weren't the sterile espresso bars you might imagine. To him, these vices were not just distractions, they were symptoms of decay. Murad saw a nation falling away from discipline, tradition, and obedience. And so, he attempted to restore order from the top down. They were cozy, smoke-filled, thick with conversation and backgammon games. Men gathered to discuss poetry, philosophy, and politics over steaming cups. It was caffeine-fueled companionship, and it spread fast. By the 15th century, Sufi mystics in Yemen had begun brewing a beverage from roasted coffee beans to help them stay awake during long nights of prayer. It was practical, spiritual, and not entirely delicious by modern standards. The bitter taste didn't stop its spread. In fact, after his death, the entire empire seemed to rethink its approach to this strange, steaming drink. From the port city of Mocha, the coffee trade trickled northward. Before long, the drink had seeped into Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and, inevitably, Istanbul. At first, coffee was welcomed. After all, the Ottoman Empire was no stranger to exotic imports or elaborate social customs. Too fast, perhaps. Not everyone was charmed. To the devout, anything that mimicked the effects of alcohol, even if it wasn't technically intoxicating, drew suspicion. Coffee sharpened the mind, yes, but it also encouraged long conversations, open debate, and, at times, criticism of the state. Worse still, people lingered in coffee houses rather than going to the mosque or working. A beverage that encouraged idleness, debate, and allegedly insubordination was a problem waiting to be percolated. Then came Sultan Murad IV. Murad ascended the throne in 1623, a turbulent time for the empire. His reign was marked by attempts to impose strict control over public morality. Murad banned tobacco, then alcohol, and finally, inevitably, coffee. But banning coffee wasn't as simple as posting a notice or issuing a decree. The logic was simple: silence dissent by closing the places where people talked too much. But what exactly made Murad so afraid of coffee? Was it the drink itself, or was it the kind of thinking it seemed to inspire? That's where the story begins to take a turn, because Murad's coffee ban didn't last forever. But what changed? What happened in the years after Murad's rule that allowed coffee to reclaim its place in Ottoman society? This time even more powerfully than before. When Sultan Murad IV issued his bans on tobacco, alcohol, and coffee, he believed he was safeguarding the soul of the Ottoman Empire. He saw these new habits, foreign, indulgent, and tied to unregulated spaces, as threats to imperial order. Yet, as so often happens in history, the more he tried to suppress coffee, the more people seemed drawn to it. Banning a beverage is one thing. Enforcing that ban across an empire that stretched from Algeria to Azerbaijan, quite another. You see, during the coffee ban, Istanbul didn't go decaffeinated, it went underground. Others were part of spice shops or bookbinders, with a kettle hidden behind curtains, or a bookshelf that rotated with the right knock. The more elaborate ones had codes of conduct, secret passwords, or special signs painted above their doors, symbols so dull and obscure that no spy would think to investigate. From Istanbul to Aleppo, from Cairo to the caravanserais of the Arabian desert, it had taken root not only as a drink, but as a ritual of daily life. He was succeeded by his brother, Ibrahim I, a more complicated figure. Ibrahim, sometimes called Ibrahim the Mad, had spent much of his life locked in the palace, isolated from the world. His reign was marked by instability, personal excess, and moments of indulgence rather than reform. Others had their establishments destroyed by imperial enforcers, but like the drink itself, the habit proved resilient. Coffee houses were one of the rare places where a cobbler and a scholar might sit side by side, where news, poetry, and stories traveled faster than any imperial courier. The court, once hostile to the drink, was beginning to embrace it. Coffee service became formalized within the imperial palace. Special servants, known as kavesi baka, were appointed to brew coffee for the sultan and his court. Or had coffee proved itself not just a social lubricant, but a tool of empire? Elaborate brewing rituals emerged, complete with engraved silver trays, delicate porcelain cups, and tiny braziers to keep the brew warm. Coffee houses began to reopen cautiously at first, then more openly. The court no longer patrolled for kettles and cups. Conversations flowed again. In a world where information was tightly controlled, coffee houses became informal schools, theaters, and newspapers, all in one. If questioned, they could always claim it was for a stomach ailment. By the 1650s, not only were coffee houses thriving, they were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Foreign envoys reported back to their courts about the sheer vibrancy of Ottoman social life. Some even feared that the ideas exchanged in these venues might one day shape the policies of the empire itself. Some began hosting storytelling nights, complete with shadow puppetry or oral recitations of epics. Others hired musicians or featured wall frescoes of Persian poetry. In time, there emerged a distinct Ottoman coffeehouse culture, with unwritten etiquette about how one should sit, sip, and speak. This tactic wasn't new. People had long used legal loopholes, to keep banned items circulating. One spice seller reportedly sold cough elixirs from Yemen in delicate porcelain cups, the only known side effect: improved conversation. Sufi mystics still used it to remain alert during midnight devotions. Merchants sipped it while negotiating prices. Poets relied on it to keep their pens moving. Even bureaucrats in the Topkapi Palace were said to sneak cups between scrolls. Secret coffee houses popped up in hidden corners of the city. Some were tucked behind bathhouses, disguised as storage rooms. There's even evidence that some vendors began brewing medicinal decoctions that just so happened to smell suspiciously like coffee. But it wasn't just about resistance, it was about community. And so, ironically, by banning coffee, Murad IV may have intensified its cultural significance. Now, it's important not to over-romanticize this underground movement. Many coffeehouse owners were arrested. Some were flogged. Murad IV died in 1640, likely of cirrhosis ironically linked to alcohol, one of the very vices he tried so hard to eradicate. One of those indulgences was coffee. Though he never officially reversed Murad's ban, enforcement relaxed almost immediately. But it was under Sultan Mehmed IV, Ibrahim's son, that coffee fully re-entered public life. Coffee even became political, again but in subtler ways. Reformers used coffeehouses to float ideas. What had started as a bitter black drink in Sufi monasteries had become a central pillar of Ottoman urban culture. And yet, something peculiar was happening behind the scenes. In the span of a few decades, coffee had gone from illicit to indispensable. But the question remains, why the change? Perhaps even more curiously, how did the Ottomans help export coffee to Europe, where it would fuel revolutions, salons, and breakfast tables for centuries to come? As you sit quietly now, cup in hand, perhaps not coffee, but imagining it too, might wonder, how did a drink once banned and berated by Ottoman authority become not only embraced by the empire, but celebrated across the world? To answer that, we must step into the later chapters of the 17th century, when coffee made its most unlikely journey from humble, controversial beginnings to a global, almost sacred habit. Ottoman coffee was prepared slowly, deliberately, often with cardamom or sugar. It was poured into finken small, handleless cup sand, sipped in silence, or during intense court meetings. Even harem life revolved in part around the beverage. It was used during courtship rituals, with bride's-to-be offering a suitor coffee, sometimes spiked with salt, to test his patience. We left off with coffee being quietly welcomed back into Ottoman life. After the strict reign of Murad IV, coffee didn't just return, it flourished. The Kavesabaka, or chief coffee maker, held one of the most trusted positions at court. Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad saw coffee houses grow in number and popularity. The Venetian envoy in the 1650s, for instance, wrote in detail about the etiquette of Ottoman coffee houses, marveling at their order, quiet, and ritual. The first coffee houses in Venice and London took direct inspiration from the Ottoman model. In fact, the first known coffee house in England was founded by a man named Pasqua, who had learned the trade in the Ottoman Empire. Voltaire drank up to 40 cups a day. Isaac Newton sipped it at the Royal Society. It fueled the very ideas that would shape modernity. He even described his brew as the turkey drink. An Ottoman proverb from the 18th century went, "Bir kavanin Kirk yil hateri vardar." A cup of coffee commits 1 to 40 years of friendship. These foreign observers often tried the drink themselves and found it, after the initial bitterness, to be stimulating and curiously pleasant. In these spaces, one could hear the daily gossip, watch a shadow puppet show, or listen to recitations from the Shahnameh. These weren't merely. They were magulous places of assembly, thought, and connection. Yet in trying to suppress coffee, he accidentally ensured its survival. The resistance brewed deeper than he could have imagined. Few remember its journey through Ottoman palaces and alleyways. Fewer still remember the Sultan who tried to stop it. Language itself carried the memory of the drink's origins. The whispers, the steam rising through the air, the small, quiet defiance of boiling water, ground beans, and belief in something more than law. This wasn't just a man with a kettle. It was an official of rank, often chosen for loyalty and discretion. After all, anything that passed the lips of the Sultan had to be safe. And what passed the Sultan's lips every morning? Coffee. Far beyond Istanbul's skyline, coffee began its journey outward, riding caravans, sailing with traders, reaching ports from Alexandria to Venice. Palace kitchens became laboratories for the perfect brew. Coffee beans, cultivated in the highlands, were brought down to the harbor in burlap sacks and shipped across the Red Sea. It refined the brewing, developed the tools, and maintained control of key ports. And though later European colonial powers would grow coffee in colonies from Java to the Caribbean, the cultural DNA of the drink always pointed back to the East. Mocha became the central export hub for coffee. So much so that the name itself became shorthand for the drink. Brewing techniques were formalized. Coffee, in short, had been transformed. From a cause for punishment, it had become a performance of refinement. But it wasn't just staying within the empire's ornate walls. How did this happen? One key factor was the port city of Mocha in Yemen, which had long been under Ottoman control. But even before coffee reached Europe, it first spread more deeply across the Muslim world. European merchants and diplomats, particularly those stationed in Constantinople, couldn't help but notice. By the late 17th century, coffee had crossed into Europe not as a forbidden substance, but as a luxurious oddity. The English word coffee itself comes from the Dutch koffie, which in turn came from the Ottoman Turkish kahve, which had journeyed from the Arabic kahwa. Yet, in Europe, coffee took on a different tone. It became a drink of Enlightenment salons, of mercantile ambition, of scientific and philosophical debate. But even as Europe claimed it as its own, the Ottoman Empire remained the heart of the coffee trade. Ironically, even as coffee became the engine of European modernity, in the Ottoman world it remained something softer, more poetic, more spiritual. And so, over the course of a century, coffee had passed through a remarkable cycle, from foreign curiosity to social menace to imperial staple to international obsession. Its story is a quiet one, brewed slowly over time, shaped not by generals or great wars, but by conversations, cravings, rituals, and resistance. And all of it hinged, once, on the decision of one Sultan Murad IV who, in an effort to control the empire, tried to erase what he saw as a threat. Today, coffee is everywhere, on kitchen counters, in airport lounges, on street corners. But perhaps, the next time you sip a cup, you'll think back to that hidden coffee house in 17th century Istanbul, and it might leave you with a simple, sleepy question. What other little rituals, so ordinary, so everyday once caused empires to tremble? Imagine the sun rising over the high Andes, throwing golden light across jagged cliffs, snow-dusted peaks, and stone trails so narrow and steep that even llamas hesitate. Below, far beneath the clouds, a small figure darts up a mountain pass. No cart, no horse, no rest, just a man running his lungs tight in the thin air, a message in his hand, and time against him. He is a Chasqui, one of the empire's most trusted couriers, and today, like every day, he runs. Welcome to the Inca Empire's postal system, one of the most efficient and surprising delivery networks the pre-modern world ever saw. No wheels, no iron tools, no horses. Every day, thousands of them ran back and forth across a vast network of roads over 25,000 miles long. This wasn't just a set of dirt paths either. In many cases, these were engineered stone roads with bridges, drainage systems, staircases, and even rest stations. Some of these roads still exist today. You see, the Inca didn't write in words or alphabets. From the Pacific coast to the mountains, from the jungle to the capital, Cusco, no horses, no carts, just trained men, terrain, and trust. Even fresh fish from the coast, packed in leaves and handed off with such speed that the emperor could eat seafood in the mountains, while it was still, in a way, fresh. Instead, they recorded numbers, records, and basic information using strings and not each configuration representing something specific. It was efficient, portable, and if you knew how to read, it's surprisingly detailed. Before we go further, let's set the stage. In some cases, they carried no cords at all. Instead, they were trusted with verbal messages, stories, instructions, poetry transmitted with the precision of a living record. The Inca Empire, Tiwantinsu, as it was called by its people, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, stretching across modern-day Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, and parts of Argentina and Colombia. Here, a fresh Chasqui waited, perched like a bird, eyes fixed on the horizon. When the incoming runner came into view, breathless and sweat-soaked, he'd blow on a conch shell or horn. This was the cue. The next runner would spring into motion before the first even arrived. At its height in the early 16th century, just before the arrival of the Spanish, it governed millions of people across wildly diverse landscapes, deserts, rainforests, highlands, and coastal plains. There were predators, both animal and human, and the mountain paths were not always forgiving. But to be chosen as a Chasqui was an honor. It meant you were quick, trustworthy, and central to the empire's function. You weren't just a messenger. You were an artery of state. And yet, the Inca had no written language. The Inca, being practical and brilliant, had designed a relay system. So how, you may ask, did they manage to govern such a vast region? The answer lies, in part, in their runners. The Chasqui were more than just fast men with strong calves. They were the nervous system of the Inca state. Now, if you're picturing a marathoner running from one city to the next, take a breath. Every few kilometers, often 5 to 7, you'd find a tambos, or small station. The baton wasn't a sticket, was often a quipu, a system of knotted cords. A message could travel hundreds of miles in a single day this way. So what did they carry? More than you'd expect. They carried orders from the emperor, reports from governors, announcements of war, warnings of rebellion. Each Chasqui was trained not only to run but to memorize. And it was no easy life. Chasqui had to be lean, swift, and resilient. The altitude alone could stagger an untrained runner. But what about their lives between the runs? How did they train? What did they eat? Where did they sleep when they weren't sprinting into the clouds? And, just as intriguingly, how did the Chasqui system help the Inca defend their empire against one of the greatest threats they would ever face? To understand what it meant to be a Chasqui, we have to pause the sprinting and take a quieter look at life in the relay stations, the rhythms of the trails, and the delicate balance between tradition, endurance, and imperial precision. Let's start with the tambos. These were more than roadside huts. Each tambo functioned as a rest stop, storage depot, and communication checkpoint. Some were no more than simple stone shelters, but larger tambos, especially those near major cities or along imperial highways, had sleeping quarters, food supplies, and even guards. There were hundreds of these scattered across the empire. They acted as the vertebrae in the backbone of communication, offering shelter not only to Chasqui but to officials, inspectors, and traveling armies. Inside, a Chasqui would find dried meats, maize cakes, and coca leaves, the latter being an essential stimulant for long distance running at high altitude. They often wore simple tunics made of alpaca wool, slung a small pouch or chuspa across their chest, and carried a staff or baton marking their authority. Others might be deployed during emergencies, droughts, battles, or death rituals. In such times, runners could be spotted day and night, sprinting by torchlight along cliffside roads, winding through cloud forests, or fording icy streams. Some wore feathered headdresses denoting rank or regional affiliation. They weren't just functionaries of the empire. They were symbols of its unity, human threads tying together mountains, valleys, and coasts. The appearance of a Chasqui on the road was a familiar sight to villagers, who were expected to offer assistance if needed, but never to interfere. The Chasqui system was the first to spot them. Reports of men with beards, strange clothing, and beasts never before seen horses filtered back to Cusco through these runners. Their warnings arrived quickly. The Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, was informed of these strange newcomers and their demands. A Chasqui on duty was sacred ground, yet the memory of the runners persisted in place names, in local lore, in the enduring roads they once traced. They carry loads on their backs, climb the ancient stairways, and guide tourists through cloud forests once sprinted by imperial messengers. Coca leaves, when chewed or brewed, eased fatigue, suppressed hunger, and helped with breathing in thin mountain air. Without a Rosetta Stone, we still don't fully understand them. The speed of their legs could not outrun the effects of disease, the betrayal of politics, or the firepower of guns and steel. Still, they ran. Even in the chaos of conquest, messages were passed, warnings delivered, final orders issued. The empire's nervous system pulsed until the very end. Others were captured and interrogated by the Spaniards, who were astounded by the speed and organization of this invisible communication web. Young boys were trained from a young age in villages deemed fit for producing runners. Pedro Ciza de Lil, century explorer, described how he saw messages delivered across mountains faster than he could believe. He called them Indians who run like deer. These training centers were often in high-altitude regions, places where lungs were strong, legs lean, and endurance bred by landscape. The most promising boys were selected for imperial service. They learned not only to run, but to observe and memorize, to carry quipus and oral messages alike, and to recite them verbatim at the next station. They were not recreational, they were survival. the Inca did not allow just anyone to become a chasqui. In a world without paper, printers, or phones, memory mattered, and the chasqui was the keeper of memory in motion. The uniform of a chasqui was minimal but symbolic, and their duties extended beyond running. A chasqui might be asked to carry gifts, precious metals, sacred plants, or messages of marriage between ruling families. Some even served in ceremonial roles. On festival days in Cusco, trained chasqui would reenact mythical journeys, tracing the paths of ancient messengers and divine envoys. And this unity was tested in 1532, when something unfamiliar entered Inca lands. The Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, a small group of armed foreigners, advanced into the empire's heartland. In some accounts, chasqui were among the first casualties when skirmishes broke out. Despite their astonishing efficiency, the chasca, like the rest of the empire, were caught off guard. But the defeat of the Inca did not erase the runners. Spanish chroniclers wrote about them with a mixture of confusion and awe. Over time, the chasqui system faded as colonial administration replaced it with European models. Even today, along the Inca Trail near Machu Picchu, some modern porters still refer to themselves, with pride, as chasqui. And so, a question remains: what happened to the knowledge they carried? The chasqui didn't just deliver goods. They were trained in quipistos, knotted cords of information. But quipus have remained frustratingly mysterious to modern historians. Could it be that messages detailed data-rich vital still lie in those knots, waiting to be deciphered? Let's return now to those strange cords. Quipus, at first glance, look like bundles of colored string, soft, tangled, unremarkable. But to the chasqui and the quipucamayux, they were documents, contracts, memories, histories. Each string bore a coded message. Different colors represented different goods or places. The position and type of knot indicated numbers in baston. A complex system of loops, braids, and spacing communicated accounting information. How many people lived in a village? How many bushels of maize were owed? How many soldiers had been conscripted? But there are signs that quipus may have gone further, that they may have recorded more than numbers. They would have been custodians of encrypted knowledge, walking librarians on a continent without paper. A handful of 21st century researchers believe certain surviving quipus may contain phonetic or syllabic elements, a kind of woven alphabet. In remote Andean villages, elders continued to use quipo-like devices to keep agricultural records well into the 19th century. An oral memory so crucial to the chasqui tradition persisted in songs, myths, and place names. He arrives at a tambo, drops to one knee, and pulls a cord from his pouch. They did it with roads, runners, rest stops, and strings. The next runner steps forward. They kneel together. With a quick series of touches and spoken words, the message transfers, not just physically, but mentally. They didn't hold office. You didn't need to be a general or a noble to serve the empire. You just needed to run every day, no matter the weather, with your whole body committed to a message. But they held the empire together. Then the new runner sprints off into the next stretch of mountains. If that's true, then the Inca weren't a civilization without writing. Just a civilization with a writing system that was entirely different from anything we'd seen before. That would make the chasqui, who carried and sometimes read these quipus, more than messengers. It's tantalizing to imagine. A chasqui runs through the Andes, heart pounding. Imagine that moment, again and again, happening thousands of times a day. Museums display quipus with reverence, even if most visitors don't know how to read them. Some of the chords remain knotted in ways no one can yet interpret. A census, a poem, a declaration of war. We still don't know. Despite the collapse of the empire, some traditions lived on. Today, archaeologists and anthropologists search for answers in the strands. But the system that carried them, the relay of runners, was undeniably brilliant. The Inca managed something astonishing. They governed a vast, mountainous empire without wheels, without riding, without beasts of burden that could gallop. And the runners, though often overlooked in grand historical summaries, were vital. They didn't wear armor. In a modern world obsessed with speed and convenience, their story is a quiet reminder of how precision, discipline, and trust can knit a society across impossible terrain. The next time you receive a notification on your phone or a letter in the post, you might just for a moment think of a Chosky pausing to catch his breath on a narrow trail above the clouds, looking to the horizon and preparing to run again. And it makes you wonder how many messages from the past are still out there, knotted, forgotten, waiting to be read. It's early morning in Paris. Sometime in the late 1600s, the cobblestones are slick with last night's rain. Market stalls are beginning to open, and bakers are hauling hot loaves to their shelves. In fact, he's standing at one of Paris's newest innovations in official urinoir, a public urinal, simple, functional, and, in the eyes of city officials, profoundly necessary. But along one quiet alley near Rue Saint-Denis, a different scene unfolds. Chamber pots were routinely emptied from windows. Urine and worse spilled into the streets. Walk anywhere and your boots would tell the story. People politely warned passers-by below before tossing a pot's contents, gardes low. But the warning wasn't always enough. A man leans casually against a wooden panel beside the street. He's not hiding. Paris was growing, and its infrastructure hadn't caught up. The question of where people went, especially men, and especially during the day, became a pressing matter of public policy. Because Paris, in the 17th century, had a problem. A smell problem. This made maintenance difficult. Rain helped, but not enough. The result was a patchwork of makeshift structures, some clean, some disgusting, most somewhere in between. Ever since the reign of Henry IV, and continuing under Louis XIII and Louis XIV, there was a growing effort to make the city more rational. Streets were widened, building facades were standardized, public fountains were built, not just for water, but as emblems of civic pride. The City of Light, for all its beauty, had for centuries lacked proper sanitation. To tame chaos, to elevate the public realm. And urinals, humble though they were, became a battleground in that campaign. Clergy members denounced them as symbols of declining public decency, and upper-class women, walking past these exposed installations, often turned away in disgust, covering their faces with handkerchiefs or parasols. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a civic crisis. Usually, they were plain wooden walls, placed strategically in busy neighborhoods. The idea was simple: give men a designated place to relieve themselves discreetly, and you could begin to tackle the river of waste flowing through the streets. Enter the Colonna a Urinora, precursor to the modern urinal. It was about power, policy, and the dream of a cleaner, more controlled world. A few turned them into advertising posts, pasting up broadsheets or handwritten flyers. There are even scattered accounts of musicians and storytellers performing beside them, turning the most mundane structure into an impromptu stage. These early installations weren't elaborate to near markets, and you risked contamination. Too far from foot traffic, and they'd go unused, worse, misused. But implementing this solution was anything but simple. First, there was the problem of placement. Where should they go? Too close to churches, and you risked offense. Officials argued over the proper locations, and while no immediate answers came, it set the stage for a much larger conversation about urban hygiene, gender, and space. City surveys were conducted. Complaints poured in from shopkeepers and residents. Some neighborhoods welcomed them. Others resisted fiercely, claiming they encouraged more vagrancy than cleanliness. Then came the question of design. Early models were little more than screens, no roof, no drainage. But what made this more than just a practical matter was how deeply symbolic it became. You see, Parisian leaders in the 17th century were obsessed with order. So managing urine, oddly enough, became part of a broader campaign to civilize the city. Interestingly, not all Parisians used them as intended. Some treated them as casual meeting spots, particularly porters, laborers, and coach drivers. Of course, there were critics. Moralists worried that the urinals encouraged vulgarity. But for all the debate, the city persisted. Records from the Parisian municipal archives show dozens of urinals being approved, repositioned, or repaired throughout the 1600s. Still, as the century wore on, new questions emerged. How should waste be removed from these sites? Who should be responsible for cleaning them? And more importantly, should women have access to similar facilities? That last question, in particular, was both politically awkward and socially loaded. So, as Paris continued to expand, and as the age of enlightenment loomed just ahead, one thing became increasingly clear. Managing a city's waste, particularly its urine, was about more than plumbing. But how did the city finally professionalize this system? Who cleaned the urinals? And what surprising innovations did 18th century engineers and chemists bring to the problem? Let's step into the shoes or boots of a sanitation worker in late 17th century Paris. It's a gray morning near Les Halles. The bustling central market, the scent of fish and ripe cheese, hangs thick in the air. Somewhere nearby, a man in a long oilcloth apron walks carefully with two wooden buckets balanced on a yoke across his shoulders. Waste didn't simply disappear. In some cases, it trickled into the gutters. But in better managed areas, especially those near upper-class neighborhoods, there were designated receptacles hidden behind the screens. These had to be emptied regularly. One hand holds a long-handled broom, the other a tin whistle blown, not for music, but to warn passersby. Necessary. Even after vigorous cleaning with vinegar, lime, or ashes, their clothing held the odor of the job. Parisians avoided them in the street. They were paid decently, often more than bakers or butchers, but lived at the edge of social respectability, feared, and, truth be told, widely despised. It had uses. Tanners used it to soften hides. Dyers used it to set colors. A few sanitation workers struck up regular arrangements with leather workshops or wool dyers, turning waste into modest profit. Paris's population was surging, especially on the right bank. What had once been a matter of a few dozen public urinals had ballooned into a network of hundreds, many poorly maintained, some completely neglected. Even some launderers swore by its power to whiten linen, though they rarely admitted it publicly. This man is known, simply, as a Vidangara cleaner of cesspits, latrines, and now, increasingly, public urinals. Satirical plays mocked the pissoirs of Paris. Foreign visitors wrote shocked observations in travel diaries, noting that one could smell entire neighborhoods before seeing them. With the spread of colonists as uriner, someone had to tend to them. This was meant to standardize care, but it also centralized control. Now, a newly created Bureau des Voies, the Office of Streets, was tasked with oversight. They learned where the best drainage spots were, which landlords were lazy about payments, and which neighborhoods had the most enthusiastic contributors to public urinals. Urinals, once informal and crude, were gradually being folded into the city's regulated infrastructure. The Vidangers were a class unto themselves. Others feared they lowered property values, and there was still the unresolved issue of access for women. Where could they relieve themselves in a city built entirely for male convenience? We know from surviving registers that urinals were counted, numbered, mapped, and scheduled for cleaning. Sand or ash was scattered beneath the structure to reduce odors. In rare cases, perfumed herbs like lavender or rosemary were burned near the urinals, though this was usually more about pleasing wealthy patrons than actually masking the odor. Or would that conversation be left for future generations? In winter, this process became trickier, as ice made both work and waste removal a hazard. Waste basin full. Smell disturbing. Market vendors. Immediate cleaning requested. Repair to rear panel advised. More than one cleaner reportedly slipped and injured themselves during routine service. Why? Well, for one, their work stank, quite literally. Many were part of family operations. A father might pass down roots, tools, and city permits to his sons. Cleaning involved more than just hauling waste. Urinal walls had to be scrubbed sometimes, using bundles of straw tied to poles. To combat the smell, the city authorized the use of certain cleaning agents. Vinegar was common. Quicklime, though dangerous, was also applied. And then there was the matter of disposal. What did one do with buckets of collected urine? Interestingly, urine in the 17th century wasn't always considered waste. This meant that enterprising Vidangers sometimes sold their haul. Particularly concentrated urine, known as land, was valued in certain industries. By the 1690s, however, the scale of urban waste was outgrowing the system. Complaints multiplied. Pamphlets criticized the city council's lack of sanitation enforcement. The monarchy responded in fits and starts. In 1691, a royal edict reclassified the maintenance of public urinals as a municipal responsibility, rather than leaving it to neighborhood associations. This office kept records, detailed ones. One entry from 1694 describes urinal No. 117, located near Pont-Neuf. Structure shows signs of damage. Even more telling, the report includes the name of the Vidanger, assigned Jean-Baptiste, and notes his previous infractions. By the dawn of the 18th century, Paris was inching toward a more modern vision of public hygiene, but not everyone was pleased. Some landlords resented their proximity. The debate grew louder. Would the city address women's needs? And meanwhile, what role did scientific advances, particularly in chemistry, begin to play in understanding and controlling urban waste? By the final decades of the 17th century, Paris was a city of staggering contrasts, of breathtaking palaces and overflowing chamber pots, of perfumes and putrefaction, often only a few steps apart. no longer just a medieval warren of cramped streets and open drains. The capital was evolving haltingly, awkwardly toward modernity. And amid the palatial visions of Louis XIV and his ministers, even something as seemingly humble as the urinal had become part of a broader debate. How should a city function? Urine overflowed into alleys, mixing with animal dung, food scraps, and laundry runoff. Paris's narrow gutters couldn't cope. In summer, the odors grew thick enough to halt market traffic in certain districts. The urinals that had started out as simple stone walls or planks now came in an array of designs. But proto-scientific minds were already asking pointed questions about air, cleanliness, and public health. A few forward-thinking nobles even constructed enclosed prives with ornate fixtures, some of which survive in illustrations. These weren't just practical, they were symbols of refinement. There were no public latrines for them. At best, they had access to chamber pots inside shops or homes, but even this depended on wealth and social standing. To be seen as above the smells of the street was to be seen as above the crowd. In 1699, a widow named Anne-Marie Rollin petitioned the city to open a small shop on the left banca boutique de soulagement where customers, for a fee, could find a moment of comfort. The growing city approach, 500,000 people, still lacked a unified sewer network. Urinals fed into gutters, cesspits, and rivers, with no centralized collection or filtration. It was, effectively, a paid lavatory disguised as a refreshment stand. One stone wall, one bucket of quicklime, one whistle-blowing vidangar at a time. Her request was denied on the grounds of indecency, but her idea would echo forward into future centuries. And how many unsung workers hauled buckets under the moonlight, keeping history flowing in the most literal way. And candlelit salons, the slow, steady work of managing public waste, kept the city moving, day by day, night by night. One curious physician, Louis, published a small treatise in 1698 titled Sur les vapeurs malines de la ville de Paris, or On the Noxious Vapors of Paris. In it, he proposed that urine-soaked streets produced not just foul smells, but pestilential airs that caused headaches, melancholy, and even spontaneous nosebleeds. Others had nicknames, like l'amour discret or le petit. Even when neglected, they were still used. Paris needed them desperately. The great urban reforms of Baron Haussmann in the mid-1800s would introduce broad boulevards, covered sewers, and standardized public toilets known as Vespasienza, more refined successor to the old urinals. Some featured curved wooden screens. Others were made from carved limestone and had rudimentary drainage grates beneath them. He lacked germ theory, microscopes, or even a reliable thermometer. Still, his arguments resonated with those tired of holding their breath on evening strolls. A few were even decorated with civic emblems, as if to grant official approval to their presence. Yet beneath the surface, the system was straining. Reports from the Bureau des Voyelles show that many urinals remained poorly maintained. Vandals knocked down walls. This didn't go unnoticed by intellectuals. Enlightenment thinking hadn't yet fully dawned. He was not entirely wrong. Ammonia fumes, combined with decomposing matter, do produce toxic compounds. But S-theories were largely speculative. Meanwhile, the public had begun pushing back in subtler ways. In wealthier districts, like La Mer, residents hired private cleaners to maintain urinals near their homes. Women, however, remained largely excluded. Most could not use the open urinals without risking scandal or arrest. In fact, city records include instances of women fined for relieving themselves discreetly in alleyways. A few entrepreneurial women did what they could. By the end of Louis XIV's reign in 1715, Paris had over 500 documented public urinals, but the system was far from sufficient. And yet, oddly, the urinals remained. They had become part of the city's rhythm. Some were meeting points. They stood, quite literally, at the crossroads of necessity and shame. It would take another century and the rise of modern engineering before public sanitation in Paris truly turned a corner. But in 17th century Paris, the city was still figuring it out. And maybe that's the strangest, most quietly heroic part of it all, that amid royal decrees. So the next time you wander a silent Parisian street, consider this: how many footsteps passed a humble wall? How many whispered complaints were lost in the rising stink of summer?